Used as a tool of control, lynchings are synonymous with oppression of African Americans. They conjure images of crowds of people engaging in a carnival of cruelty and savagery. Lynchings, as they are widely understood, have a number of key characteristics. They involve at least 3 people, though it could be in the thousands, with an accusation usually levied against an individual or group of black people, though other races would be targeted. It is perhaps helpful to start with the origins of lynchings. The term is thought to have originated from the Lynch family. They were a wealthy merchant family who during the Revolutionary Wars sought to maintain some semblance of law and order. At a time where there was little in the way of a structured judiciary, vigilante justice was used as the alternative. Trial by committee would dole out punishments such as beatings, floggings, or the accused being tarred and feathered. It was a common form of punishment employed on the western frontiers, where self-described regulators would deal with transgressions of all manner of bandit, highwayman, or general reprobate. By the 1830s, the use of lynching started to take a more racial dimension. In the South, abolitionists and those suspected of engaging in or plotting slave uprisings were the targets. Lynchings were used as an extra level of control against both the enslaved and against those who sought to fight against slavery. One of the first examples of this can be seen in a lynching that took place in Madison County, Mississippi, in the year 1835. A story was created of a planned slave uprising, which stirred up much in the way of panic amongst the community. What followed was the hangings of the supposed ringleaders, 2 white men, and a number of enslaved black people. This type of lynching would become commonplace in the South of America as a tool to maintain slavery. As time progressed, black people would become the main victims of lynchings, with hangings and torture being the punishment used. One of the key events that marked this shift was the American Civil War. One of the key reasons of the American Civil War was over the abolition of slavery. With the South defeated, what followed was a term known as Reconstruction. This period of time deserves a video of its own, but the goal was to bring back the states that had split from the Union back into the fold and to rebuild the country. For many in the South, any rise in the status of black people was to be fought against. The Ku Klux Klan was founded by former Confederate officers to promote white supremacy and to resist the Reconstruction efforts. One of the Klan's key targets of violence would be freedmen, which would include not only lynchings, but also ways to suppress the freedmen from voting. Where black people became voters, they would hold substantial political power wherever they represented the majority of the electorate. For many in the South, such a situation was unthinkable, and disputed elections often resulted in massacres of black people. One example can be seen in the newly formed parish of Colfax, Louisiana. Around 150 freedmen and 3 white men who supported equality were massacred by former Confederate soldiers following protests of a fraudulent election designed to stifle the vote of the free men. There was, however, little in the way of punishment for those responsible. In a way, it confirmed to many that there would be little to no action taken against those who sought to rebuild the old ways of slavery and the subjugation of black people. Lynchings became a tool to re-establish white supremacy and suppress black civil rights through political and social violence. From 1882 to 1889, the ratio of black to white lynching victims was 4-to-1. This increased to more than 6-to-1 between 1890 and 1900, which then exploded to more than 17-to-1 after 1900. At this point in time, the purpose of lynchings was no longer to deal with crime. Long gone were the days of frontier justice and the turmoil of the Revolutionary War. There were functioning courts and a functioning justice system. Convicted African Americans could face legal execution, forced labor, or all manner of fines. The goal of lynchings was terror and social control. In fact, many of the victims of lynchings were not even convicted of any crime, nor even accused. Even if a person was charged with a crime or even convicted, it was unlikely they had received a fair trial and due process. Often a lynch mob would take the law into their own hands well before the legal process had completed, as can be seen in the lynching of William James in 1909. Around 10,000 people attended his lynching following him being charged with SA. He was dragged from his jail, hanged, and his body riddled with bullets, and his corpse dragged through the streets. Some examples of the types of transgressions that resulted in lynchings included that of Keith Bowen. He was accused of trying to enter a room where 3 white women were already sitting. No further accusations were made, and yet Bowen was lynched. Another was that of Thomas Miles Sr., who was accused of writing a letter to a white woman inviting her out for a drink. For this, he was lynched, and according to a newspaper at the time, his corpse was riddled with bullets. Even what would be considered an innocuous accident could result in a lynching, as seen in the example of Jeff Brown. Jeff was running for a train when he accidentally bumped into a white girl. One of the key drivers behind lynchings was the fear of black men fraternizing with white women. This fear resulted in many lynchings. But news reports of these lynchings would often justify the murder and pushed the false narrative that the black men were a threat to white women. The mere suggestion that a black man had any romantic contact with a white woman, consensual or otherwise, could be enough to trigger a lynching. But any general transgression committed by a black person against a white person could be grounds enough for a person to be lynched. Examples of reasons given for lynchings could include speaking disrespectfully to a white person, refusing to step aside on the pavement, or just by using bad language. As the purpose of lynchings changed, so too did the way lynchings were carried out. Lynchings would attract large crowds, turning the murder of a person into some form of entertainment. Thousands would attend to see the latest example being made, watching the black victims' prolonged torture, dismemberment, and burning at the stake. In many instances, food stalls and souvenir shops were erected at the lynchings. Photographs of the deceased would be taken and sold as postcards. The victims' bodies would be dismembered and the parts sold as trophies to the attendees. Whilst lynchings predominantly targeted African Americans, they were not the exclusive victims. Following the lynching of William James, the mob returned to the jail from which they had taken him and took a white man named Henry Selzer. Selzer had been accused of murdering his wife. He too was beaten, hanged, and riddled with bullets. Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans were also targeted by lynchings in the South and Southeast regions. More often than not, these lynchings followed the allegations of a crime and involved law enforcement officials as part of the mob. It is thought that 232 Mexicans were murdered from 1849 until 1928 in Texas alone. Such acts were largely seen as a way to maintain social and economic status of white Americans on the border. One notable example can be seen in the case of Antonio Gomez, a 14-year-old who, following an altercation, killed a man by the name of Charles Zishan. Gomez was jailed, but such was the anger against the crime that it was expected that he would be lynched when transported to the county jail. A mob soon followed Gomez and the constable he was with, demanding that he be handed over to them instead. He was taken by the mob, beaten, and hanged from a ladder, only 3 hours after the death of Charles. One of the prominent anti-lynching crusaders was Ida B. Wells. She had known 3 men who were lynched in 1892 and sought to combat the practice. She had long been an advocate for black education and an avid journalist. She turned her talents to recording lynchings and their causes. She was a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. She, with the NAACP, fought for lynching to become a federal crime, though any attempts for such legislation were blocked by the Southern senators. The fight for such an act would be passed only in 2022, in what is termed as the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. No discussion on lynching would be complete without explaining the tragic murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till. Emmett was born in 1941 in Chicago, though his parents moved north from Mississippi seeking better job prospects. Emmett wanted to visit the region because his cousins and aunt lived there. His family explained to him in no uncertain terms that life in the South was very different to the North, and explained that he would need to check his behavior in front of the white people. Jim Crow laws that rendered black people as second-class citizens were very much still in place and enforced in Mississippi. In 1955, Emmett visited the town of Money in Mississippi. One day, Emmett and other youths visited a grocery store run by Roy and Carolyn Bryant. What took place is still very disputed. Some assert that Emmett dared to flirt with Carolyn to prove that he did in fact have a white girlfriend. Some asserted that he whistled at Carolyn, which, was something that Emmett would do to control his stutter. But according to Carolyn, Emmett grabbed her by the waist, made incredibly lewd comments, and made strong advances towards her. When Roy Bryant returned from a business trip, he was told by Carolyn of what Emmett had apparently done to her. Roy and his half-brother, John William Millman, went to Emmett's uncle's house in the early hours of the 28th of August and took Emmett away. He was bundled into a car, beaten, and taken to a river. Emmett was made to carry a 25-pound cotton gin fan to the bank of the river and ordered to strip. The two men then savagely beat Emmett near to death, gouged out his eye, and shot him in the head. Emmett's body was tied to the cotton gin fan with barbed wire and dropped into the river. When his body was recovered 3 days later, he could only be identified by a ring that he still wore. Whilst his uncles wanted a quick funeral to spare his family of the trauma, Emmett's mother insisted that her son receive an open casket funeral so the world could see just what had been done to Emmett. Reactions were largely of outrage, with prominent politicians and newspapers all condemning the murder. Bryant and his half-brother were indicted for murder. The trial would bring forth multiple witnesses, from Emmett's uncle who identified the pair as the kidnappers, to people who witnessed the pair beating Emmett in a tool shed. The trial took place in a segregated courthouse, with hundreds of spectators and journalists. The defense's case rested on whether Emmett was actually dead, stating that it was not possible to identify him from his mutilated body. It took an all-white jury 1 hour to find the pair not guilty. 1 year later, Bryant and Millman would give their story to Look magazine. They confessed to what they did to Emmett, and Millman justifying his actions by saying, "What else could I do? He thought he was as good as any white man." Carolyn Bryant later in life would reportedly state that she had made up that Emmett had harassed her. The murder of Emmett is often seen as the spark that lit the civil rights movement, or at least as defining the movement. Within the next few months, some of the major events of the civil rights movement would take place, including the Montgomery bus boycott. From the late 1900s until the 1950s, it is thought that some 4,730 people were murdered by lynchings, the vast majority being black people. Lynchings represent the grim reality of vigilante justice, of the dangers of mob mentality, and the violence employed to maintain a racial hierarchy. Lynchings show us the dangers of how such violence can be normalized.